unlike Lovecraft's hybrids of the deep ones, Grayscale is thought to be transmitted rather than inherited. But that doesn't mean that it can't be inherited if someone afflicted with it has offspring. But it isn't always fatal in children, and the small folk and the wildlings sometimes say that it only sleeps in those who have been afflicted with it during childhood, and that it'll come back later, maybe in middle age, maybe to turn you into a fish. There's a possibility it may have started out as a hereditary disease among the Roinar. It may be something that resulted in the Roinar, or descendants of men and fish people, breeding with other types of humans who couldn't handle it, or whose genome or genetic makeup wasn't compatible with this newly introduced gene. Again, we see a parallel with microcephalin D. Although microcephalin D has made a sweep in 70% of the human population, it is also one of the genes that causes microcephaly. There are some genes that just don't mix with it. One of the reasons that they have blood tests when people get married is to tell you the percentage chance of having some kind of a birth defect, because certain genes don't mix so well with other genes. Now, in 70% of Earth's population, microcephalin D has already made its sweep. That means that in those populations, in the past, microcephalin most likely caused microcephaly by mixing with genes it was, so to say, incompatible with. But since most microcephalics die early and don't reproduce, it's gone from their genome, their population genome. But when you have someone with microcephalin D who introduces himself sexually to a population that has very little contact with microcephalin D, there's always the possibility that it'll mix with one of these genes that has not been weeded out in that genome yet. In George Martin's universe, Grayscale could have started out in a similar way. The descendants of fish people breeding with descendants of non-fish people, and it causes this disease, and after mutations, this disease maybe becomes airborne. It's a fantasy world. It's not exactly like our science, but it could also be seen as an analogy. At the end of the last ice age, the New Santeo culture seems to have spread the idea of civilization in megaliths and the 7-man or 7-god pantheon to a lot of the beginning points of Earth's early civilizations. After the flooding of Sundaland, they had this microcephalin D, they had a maritime culture, and incidentally, 90% of Earth's Y haplogroups went extinct right about the same time. In other words, this patriarchal society of god kings or sea kings began civilization, and they didn't kill off the hunter-gatherer women. They incorporated them into their society, but they did kill off the male lineages of any of the hunter-gatherer societies who didn't incorporate into them. And we see this happening time and time again in the history of Westeros as well. It may not be that they only killed them off with arms and weapons and warfare, but also by their diseases, much like the colonists to the Americas killed off most of the Native Americans with disease. Most flus and epidemics seem to come from the sea. It's said that they're carried from seabirds to swine into civilizations that live in close proximity to pigs, mostly in the Far East. And I think that this Grey Plague, the Stone Men, this disease may have come from the very beginnings of civilization in the Far East, in Asai, or among the progenitors of the Rhoynar. And it may, by the end of the whole series, kill off everyone who doesn't have an immunity to it. And this is kind of an explanation of our history, an explanation of our own real world bottlenecks in human evolution. Maybe they were caused by disease, or one disease, maybe even a disease that resulted from mixing with other hominids. It's interesting to note that most of our genomes come from Homo sapiens sapiens. Only 4% seems to come from Neanderthals. Up to 8% comes from Denisovan and Papua New Guinea cultures, and there's up to like 7 or 8% in some Nigerian populations, I think, that have the blood of what might be Iruo Alero. But most of our genes seem to have come from Homo sapiens sapiens. However, most of our immune systems have been proven to have come from Neanderthals and Denisovans. And it makes sense. When you move into a territory and mix with a people that have been there for thousands upon thousands of years, you're likely to keep the things that help them to survive in that environment. Any immunity to malaria would be good. Any immunity to any local diseases would be good. The Tibetans have preserved a gene that helps them breathe at high altitudes that has its origins in Denisovans. But with mixing also comes diseases that you may not have been exposed to in the past and therefore have no immunities to. And therefore those who are hybrids often survive because of hybrid vigor. And so, if there's a worldwide spread of the Gray Plague, the only people that are going to survive it are those who have an immunity to it. And if the Song of Ice and Fire ends at the beginning of our own pre-recorded history, then we have an explanation of one of the bottlenecks of human evolution. If the Rhoynar or the New Santeo culture took women and killed men, and then there was an outbreak of this disease that only their children or descendants are immune to, then only the matrilineal lineages, then only the descendants of the hunter-gatherer women they had taken in and the hunter-gatherer men that they had taken into their society would survive, because their offspring would have the immunity too, at least in some percentage. Whereas the hunter-gatherers wouldn't have it at all. As the disease spread to them, they would all die off, and presumably they would most likely take more women than they would take men, especially if they were a slave culture or a dominant culture. So maybe one of the functions of a Song of Ice and Fire is working out in George R. R. Martin's subconscious how exactly those who survived the end of the Ice Age actually survived. It's unclear in A Song of Ice and Fire who exactly has the immunity to Grayscale or the Gray Plague, but it's evident that the Targaryens at least have some immunity to it. There's a quote from Barristan Selmy where he is telling Daenerys how the Targaryens are untroubled by the common sicknesses of the people. And the only Targaryen blood that I could find that's had Grayscale is Shireen. It may be that her Targaryen blood is so watered down that she didn't get the gene that makes her immune to all the diseases. Or it may be that Shireen might have survived her childhood sickness without her father's help, or maybe even turned into a deep one. Or it may be even that the Baratheon claim that they have Targaryen blood isn't actually true, and something happened sometime that we don't know about to stop that flow of Targaryen blood. But there's another group of people that seems to be somewhat immune to the Grayscale. I've never heard of a Stark or any of the first men having it, none of the Umbers or anything like that. With the possible exception of the Greyjoys, one of Theon's uncles seems to have had Grayscale as a child, and Euron admits to Aaron Damphair that he murdered him. He says he squeezed his nose to suffocate him. He didn't need to squeeze his mouth or hold his mouth shut because his mouth was already closed from the Grayscale, which makes me question, why didn't Euron get Grayscale? He's touching a Grayscale person's nose, but he doesn't get Grayscale. How is that? Tyrion seems to maybe be immune to Grayscale, but he may be a Targaryen, so that may not have anything to do with his dual descent from also the First Men. But no one knows where these stone men go. We know that they go to some places in exile like Old Valyria, but what happens eventually? When do they die? Nobody really seems to know how long they live or what happens to them. It could be that they turn into merlings or squishers and go to join the deep ones underneath the sea. They look really at home in the water when they jumped off the bridge and came to attack Tyrion and Jorah in the series. And it said that Grayscale thrives in cool, damp places. In a recent post by Donna Dickens in HitFix, she discusses Jorah Mormont's current predicament in the television series. The post is entitled, "Did Game of Thrones just send Jorah Mormont to find another undead army?" Some have theorized that Jorah will head for Old Town to try to find a cure for his Grayscale, and therefore come in contact with Sam Tarly, who will figure out how to cure it for him. And the presumption there might be that the Maesters are the ones who cured Shireen's Grayscale for Stannis. But we don't know that a Maester helped Stannis cure Shireen's Grayscale. In fact, this article does a pretty good job of explaining how it might have been the Red Priest who did so for her. Maybe that is why Stannis accepted the arrival of Melisandre. Despite being an unsuperstitious man, he had some faith in R'hllor or the religion of the Red God, and therefore was open to Melisandre coming in and pretty much taking over his whole rulership. She also postulates that the cure may have been holy fire, that Stannis actually had to burn the Grayscale off of Shireen. And that's why it's kept so quiet, because who would want to admit that they set flame to their own daughter? So we start with how Shireen contracted the Grayscale in the first place. No culprit has been given in the books, but during the "sorry I'm about to murder you" speech on the show, Stannis confesses to Shireen that it was a doll brought by a Dornish traitor that caused the Grayscale. On the one hand, that would mean Grayscale either has an alarmingly long half-life or the Dornishman was an assassin. But on the other hand, given Stannis' track record as kind of a jerk, I gave that story some serious side-eye. So I did a little digging into the Baratheon family tree. It didn't take long to find another perpetrator of Shireen's Grayscale, Stannis. But if I'm right, at least it was an accident. She goes on to talk about the Mad King Aerys, how after Aerys was released from prison in Duskendale, he was obviously insane and a broken man, paranoid. About a year later, he sent Steffon Baratheon to Old Volantis to search for a bride for Rhaegar. Steffon Baratheon is both Robert Baratheon and Stannis Baratheon's father, also Renly Baratheon's father. But Danya speculates that his real mission was not to go find a bride, but actually to go find a biological weapon. It makes sense because at this time Aerys was looking for these kind of weapons. He used wildfire. He was very paranoid, as we've said. And Old Volantis is a good place to start looking for Grayscale. It also doesn't jibe with the fact that Aerys was paranoid even about Rhaegar at this time and thought he was planning to usurp him. Donna says that Volantis would be a good place to look for such a biological weapon. Legend says Grayscale sprung into being when the lords of Valyria and Volantis conquered the festival city of Corain. Men, women, and children were slaughtered without mercy, while their prince, Garin, was forced to watch from a gilded cage. In his grief, Prince Garin prayed to the Mother Roin, and she rose up out of her banks to destroy the Fire Lords with a flood and the curse of Grayscale. The stone men still roam the ruins of Shireen, and some say Valyria as well. Some myths even say the doom of old Valyria was the curse of Garin coming to full fruition. Those who live in Volantis would be well acquainted with the disease. But if Stephen Baratheon was bringing back a cache of biological weapons for his Mad King, he never made it. Robert and Stannis watched in horror from Dragonstone as their father's ship was destroyed in a storm a mere few miles from safe harbor. Stephen, his wife, and hundreds of their men died. If Aerys, too, had designs on controlling his people through Grayscale, those plans died too, until Stannis dug it up. Donna goes on to speculate that when Stannis was ordered to rebuild the fleet of the Seven Kingdoms after the Greyjoy rebellion, that being a prudent man, he sent people to excavate the ruins of his father's ship to salvage what they could. I think this is highly unlikely, but I think that her post has led me to something very interesting. Donna seems to be looking at this from more of a television show viewer's perspective. She doesn't mention Patchface. Stannis Baratheon doesn't have to go excavate the ruins of his father's ship in order to receive something from it, because Patchface survived the wreck and he washed up on the shore. He's not in the series, but he's in the books, and I think he's very important to understanding all of this. I don't know if Stannis Baratheon will eventually say the same thing to Shireen in the books as he said in the show, that it came from a doll, or whether they used a doll instead of Patchface in order to illustrate this, because Patchface isn't in the show. However, whatever he says, I think it's an analogy for Patchface. Patchface is kind of a doll. He's a toy. He's a dwarf, and he was kept for Shireen's amusement. He was a gift to Shireen after the shipwreck. Patchface was recovered from the sea before Shireen was born, if I'm reading everything right. However, once Shireen was born, Patchface was assigned to her and follows her everywhere in the books, and they're fast friends. Patchface doesn't have Grayscale, but Patchface was saved from drowning by a figure that is a whole lot like a Merling or a Deep One, and it may be that he has some kind of a natural immunity to it. I think that it's Patchface who somehow transmitted this Grayscale to the little girl. And this brings us to the possibility that some people can be carriers of the disease without contracting the disease. Maybe there's people who are immune to it, but there's also people who aren't so much immune to it as they become carriers of it, and they just don't exhibit any of the symptoms. Maybe they don't exhibit the symptoms until they get middle-aged, as in Lovecraft's version, and then they slip back into the sea. Patchface's experience being drowned and saved from drowning are very much like the experience of Prince Garin on the Roin, as well as the shrouded god of the Stone Men, the drowned god of the Iron Men, and the experience that the Storm King of the First Age or Dawn Age or Age of Heroes had when he drowned off the coast of Stormed Inn. It's a whole lot like the story that the Starks have of the Night's King and how he was saved by a woman in the woods. They're all saved by these godlike women, either of ice or of water, who have cold lips, usually blue eyes, and they always save them from drowning. In the case of the Starks, we don't know that the Night's King was saved from drowning or from freezing, but it seems like she must have saved him from something. And I'm going to get into detail about that in a little bit. But to quote Donna, what's more tantalizing? In the door, we learn the White Walkers are the product of the children of the forest attempting to defend themselves against the First Men. In turn, the White Walkers created the Whites, mindless ice zombies meant as meat shields and cannon fodder. They represent the armies of ice in the Song of Ice and Fire, but as of yet, there is no high fantasy army for fire, unless it's the Stone Men and the Shrouded Lord. The Stone Men behave very much like zombies, nearly mindless and feeling no pain. Their skin is reminiscent of dragon scales. There's been little and less mention of the Shrouded Lord who rules over the Stone Men, but what we do know sounds similar to the Night's King. The Shrouded Lord allegedly can spread Grayscale with a gray kiss, though he gives it out sparingly. It seems more likely he would be gifting his kiss to those he wishes to make life like himself, as the Night's King converts Craster's son into White Walkers. There are even those who believe the Shrouded Lord is Prince Garin himself, still ruling over the remnants of his civilization. Of course, there's another myth that says the Shrouded Lord was brought to life when a woman with lips as cold as ice kissed him. Sounds a little like the Night's Queen, doesn't it? Yes, it does, Donna. And it also sounds a lot like the story of the origin of the Storm's King, as well as the King of the Iron Islands, the Grey King. And it sounds like several other of the heroes we have in Westerosi or Planetos myth. Now, this leads this journalist to make the conclusion that the Stone Men are going to be on Dany's side, that they're going to oppose the White Walkers in some way. I'm leaning more to the idea that they are of the same thing. The Shrouded Lord is the same thing as the Great Other. He may be also the same thing as the Lion of Night, the Drowned God. In all the stories, or in most of the stories, he has blue eyes. He drowns or gets lost or gets grayscale, and then a woman with blue eyes and lips as cold as ice kisses him. Sometimes it's underwater, sometimes it's not. But I get the general impression that you can be saved from drowning or from the grayscale or for turning into a white by the kiss of this woman with blue eyes and cold skin or cold lips. And it's interesting to me that on the show there are no male children of the forest. The only reference in the books we have of any mention of male children of the forest is when Master Lewin is talking to Bran and he refers to the green seers as men among them, but he could be speaking men in the sense of both men and women as a race of people or a species of people, or he may just not know. I mean, after all, he's Master Lewin, he's from the Maesters, he doesn't know much about the children of the forest. Most of them think that they're a myth. None of the whites that we've seen so far, or none of the White Walkers that we've seen so far, have been female. So it makes me wonder whether really we're talking about a kiss or if we're talking about these children of the forest, possibly aquatic children of the forest as well, saving these first men, or in some cases Rhoynar, from drowning or from grayscale or from defeat by placing this obsidian dagger in their heart, like we saw on the show. It'd be a great twist if everybody is believing that the children of the forest actually made the White Walkers, and in a sense they did, but what they're really doing is they're keeping these undead people who have been converted by the Deep Ones into sentient undead. In a lot of George R. R. Martin science fiction, you have this opposing force to mankind that is trying to protect the planet and trying to stand up for nature against technology. And they have a Borg mind, not a communal mind so much as a hive mind, where one person does the thinking for everybody, or if the consciousness of the whole species is one thought form, they all think the same thing, and their individuality is stripped away as humans meld into this hive mind that opposes them when they're coming to a new planet or a new reality. And this is a theme that we see throughout George R. R. Martin's science fiction work. Preston Jacobs is really knowledgeable about that and discusses it in detail on his YouTube channel. But I'm starting to get the sense that the making of the White Walkers by the Children of the Forest wasn't making them undead, so to speak, so much as altering the course of another magic that was taking place on this person. And the evidence for this is that, well, there was supposed peace for 4,000 years between men and the Children of the Forest before the White Walkers came to be in the Long Night. The Long Night seems to be a global thing, and so it doesn't seem that the Children of the Forest invoked the Long Night. All of the old cultures in Essos, Westeros, and even beyond seem to have legends of this Long Night happening. Some references even seem to suggest that there were White Walkers on Essos too. And if not White Walkers, then at least demons from the Lion of Night, who is associated with the moon. We also have legends of the small folk, especially when referring to Patchface, when they say that the Shrouded Lord or the Drowned God favors those who can make him laugh. So there are some who have speculated that Patchface, being a very witty fool before he was drowned and then went insane, was able to make the Shrouded Lord laugh. There's also a deleted scene from Tyrion's encounter with the Stone Men, where George R. R. Martin wrote a chapter he really liked. It was really eerie. He loved it, but he left it out because it was taking him down a path that he couldn't go down. And there have been those who have speculated that Tyrion actually meets the Shrouded God down there, the ruler, the supposed ruler of the Stone Men. But what if it isn't really that this drowned god saves those who can make him laugh, as much as it is that the ones that get saved tend to be witty? He seems to have let both Tyrion and Patchface live, and they're both dwarves. Could dwarfism in Planetos be one of the signs of hybridization with the Deep Ones in the past? Are descendants of Deep Ones a little less honest and a little more witty and a little bit more worldly than those who are more on the side of Neanderthals and are blindly honest and will take everything for granted and at face value? You could even draw parallels between the honesty of tonal languages, where you can't really be sarcastic because if you change your pitch in your word, you're saying something totally different. Whereas tonal languages use their pitch to mean all kinds of different things that you might only know if you're an insider. No matter what pitch you say a word in a non-tonal language, it still means the same thing, basically, but it can have added meaning depending on whether you say it sorrowfully, sadistically, and things like that, whereas tonal languages tend to be more literal and, in a way, honest. It's also hard to translate humor from tonal languages to non-tonal languages, partly because of this. So it may be that those who are witty are often descended from the deep ones, and therefore they have a tendency to at least somewhat be able to breathe underwater, and an immunity to grayscale, or at least an immunity to the effects of grayscale. So what we seem to have here is many instances of these H.P. Lovecraftian coastal dwellings where societies of men have been influenced by the deep ones. Some of these descendants of the deep ones, as well as Targaryens, seem to have somewhat of an immunity to grayscale, and these people are sometimes saved from drowning or grayscale by these deep ones, who are often women with blue eyes and cold lips.